C'est à la fois un grand plaisir pour moi d'être là et en fait assez impressionnant parce que bon, le temps passe, mais quand j'étais live ici, je ne me disais pas que je ferais un colloquium un jour. Mais il était temps de le faire. Je vais très vite passer à l'anglais, mais avant de commencer le séminaire formel, je voulais vous dire que je voulais dédier ce séminaire à un de mes copains, un de mes camarades, Maxime Dahan, qui enseignait aussi à l'X, qui avait fait sa thèse ici au LKB. Alors, bon, la plupart d'entre vous êtes un peu jeunes, et vous ne l'avez pas connu, c'est dommage, c'était quelqu'un d'absolument formidable. C'était quelqu'un de solaire, comme le montre cette photo. Et il est parti brutalement cet été, beaucoup trop vite. Il avait 46 ans, il laisse 3 enfants assez jeunes. Et ça a été vraiment, je crois que pour tous les gens qui l'ont connu, c'est quelque chose de très dur à supporter. Enfin, et Maxime était vraiment quelqu'un de merveilleux. Voilà, donc on pense à lui. Bon, je vais faire le séminaire en anglais, il faut bien faire le séminaire, je vais le faire en anglais, si vous êtes d'accord. So I'm going to talk about recent progress in non-equilibrium statistical mechanics. But to understand non-equilibrium statistical physics, one has to recap what has been done during the last 150 years in thermodynamics and in equilibrium physics, and to contrast with it, to see some recent progress and some general results far from equilibrium. So the first two topics are not, they are of course the framework, and some results are results, some results are recent, but they are not my work. Kai told me that nobody would be interested in my last calculation, so I decided almost not to talk about it. So at the very end, I will tell you about some of the results that have been obtained either by myself or by other people in the same kind of spirit, but I will probably have to rush through it, and it's going to be a bit technical, but hopefully you will get something from the first 2 points, and maybe something from the third one too. Okay, so let's start with equilibrium. Equilibrium is the realm of thermodynamics. And thermodynamics is the science of energy conversions. So when we convert energy into one form to another, we have to be careful to identify all possible forms of energy that we have, chemical energy, mechanical energy, and so on, work, heat, and so on. That's the first principle. And also, the second principle tells us that all forms of energy are not equivalent. There is a kind of fee of conversion, like when you change dollars into euros and vice versa, there is a kind of compensation fee, which is measured by the entropy. By the way, the word thermodynamics contains dynamics, which means something which is changing with time. But if you think about it, time never appears in your classical thermodynamic course. There's no time variable. That's very strange. It's always somehow under the carpet. So Onsager, who was one of the great specialists of thermodynamics, and who knew almost all about it, even himself recognized that although the maths behind thermodynamics is quite trivial, the science of thermodynamics is very subtle. And probably most of us have experienced that it's quite difficult to get thermodynamic reasoning right. It's quite easy to make sign mistakes, factor 2 mistakes, or even much worse than that. Anyway, so the first principle tells us that the energy of the universe is constant. Typically, variation of energy is transferred through work and heat. But this is not the end of the story. We know that in nature, some processes are possible and some are not allowed by nature. Some machines can be constructed and some machines can't. And to distinguish between what is possible and what is forbidden, you need another principle, which is the second principle, which has many different ways of being spelled out, for example, by Clausius, Kelvin, Planck, or others. And one way of formulating it is to introduce the entropy, following Clausius, and to say that in any process which is allowed by nature, which happens in nature, the entropy has to increase, or at best, to remain constant. So the entropy of the universe increases. Okay, now you have two principles and somehow two contradictory requirements. A system would like to minimize its energy and it would like to maximize its entropy. So this is really the heart of equilibrium statistical physics and thermodynamics, this competition between the mistress of the world, the energy, and her shadow, the entropy. And this competition leads to most of the phenomena, phase transitions, whatever we are used to, or for example, osmotic pressure. if you have a semi-permeable membrane which separates a solution which is very dense, concentrated in ions, and another one which has very little ions in it, well, it will take, you know, a kind of unnatural shape from the point of view of mechanics, but you need that for a point of view of entropy. Okay, so these two thermodynamic potentials, the energy and the entropy, they can be accounted for together for systems which are at thermal equilibrium at temperature T by taking them together in one potential, which is the free energy. So the free energy is given by the energy minus the temperature times the entropy, and a system at thermal equilibrium wants to optimize its free energy. He wants to minimize it. So this gives you a minimization principle that allows you to determine what the thermodynamic equilibrium state is, if you know this function. So this free energy is introduced here as a kind of formal object, but it has a very nice interpretation, a kind of engineering interpretation, which was known to the founding fathers already in the 19th century. So let's take, of course, it's much more general than that, but just let's take for illustration the image of the gas in a piston. So suppose that you have your gas, which is at equilibrium with the environment at temperature T and has an initial volume VA. I'm pulling on the piston, coming to a volume VB, and the question is how much maximal work I can extract from this mechanical device. Well, the maximal useful work I can extract from this device is at best the decrease of the free energy of the system. Of course, from hydroelectricity or whatever basic mechanics, you know that if you have something which is falling from a height h, you can extract a work mgh. But here things are irreversible. You have temperature, you have thermodynamics, so you have to replace mechanical energy by free energy, and also you don't have an equality, but you have an inequality. The inequality is due to non-reversibilities. At best, if you do things very slow and reversibly, you can at best achieve the equality. I imagine that all that is familiar, even to young students, hopefully. But this is okay, thermodynamics. The next step is StatMech. So StatMech was founded in the 19th century by a few people, but maybe the two major names are Maxwell Boltzmann and maybe Gibbs a bit later. And you're probably going to have a full lecture of StatMech, or already started it. If you want to put StatMech in one slide, you can put it that way. You can say that if you look at a system at a macroscopic scale, a given system, it has many microscopic configurations underlying a given macroscopic configuration. The microscopic configurations are different from each other. So in fact, a system at temperature T, at equilibrium at temperature T, samples its microscopic configurations with a probability distribution. So it's really a probabilistic point of view on physics. And each microscopic configuration is sampled according to the canonical Boltzmann-Gibbs law. A configuration C of energy E appears at equilibrium with a probability given by exponential minus E over kT with a normalization, which is the partition function. And this probability distribution allows you to reconstruct the macroscopic thermodynamics of your system. In particular, if you know the partition function Z from combinatorics, you have really to count the microscopic states and then to weigh them with the Boltzmann distribution. So if you know the partition function, you can reconstruct the free energy. And if you have the free energy, you can reconstruct the equation of state, you can find phase transitions, you can reconstruct the thermodynamics of your model. So this is a very well-defined prescription. This is a trick, this is a cooking recipe to study systems at thermal equilibrium. But it goes beyond thermodynamics. Why? Because it tells you that at the microscopic scale, you have a probability distribution, which means that whenever you have a probability distribution, you have not only mean values, but you have, of course, fluctuations. You have variances or higher cumulants, higher moments. Things fluctuate. So StatMech is stronger than thermodynamics. It contains it, but it's stronger because it predicts fluctuations. It predicts that you have average values and you have variations, you have variances around these average values, and you can compute any statistical average observable correlation using that probability distribution. So whenever one talks about fluctuations, of course, the most fluctuating or the canonical fluctuating object that one can think about is the Brownian motion, a single pollen grain or whatever you like immersed in a drop of water, and you look at it through a microscope and you see that the pollen grain will do a never-ending jiggling, and the origin of this jiggling was a mystery during the 19th century, and it was, of course, found. There were some other people, but mostly found by Einstein for his thesis. He already worked on it in the early 1900s, and in 1905 he published the theory of Brownian motion. And what he found is that if you look at the trajectory of a Brownian particle here, you should not try to compute the speed of the particle, of the pollen at a given time. You should try to understand some statistical features of that object. And some statistical features that are obvious would be its average position, but it has the same probability of going up and right or left and right, up and down, so the average position is 0. So the next non-trivial thing to look at is the average quadratic mean, so the average value of x squared. And what Einstein was able to do, ab initio, from the first basic principles of StatMech, he was able to show that x squared grows linearly with time. This is the diffusion law. And he was able to compute the prefactor. Okay, there's a factor 2 for historical reasons, but to compute the diffusion constant d. And this diffusion constant d, he expressed it in terms of the heat perfect gas constant, R, the temperature, the viscosity eta of the liquid, the water you're immersed in, the size of your pollen particle, and the Avogadro number. So this gave a way, in fact, to compute the Avogadro number that Perrin used slightly later to get a value of n and to get the Nobel Prize too later. Okay, so that's a free Brownian motion. But let's think now that your pollen particle is slightly charged and you apply an electric field. So of course there will be a thrust, an electric force on your pollen particle, and it will acquire, in the long time limit, a limiting speed. And this limiting speed is just given by the balance between viscous drag and electrical force. And you will find that this limiting speed V infinity is given by sigma times the force applied, and the sigma is just given by Stokes' drag force. Okay? If you identify this sigma, which is the response to an external field, and you use Einstein formula for the diffusion constant, you can eliminate almost all the features, that special feature, the 6, the pi, whatever, the size of your particle, and you get a very neat relation between sigma, which tells you how much current, the speed of this particle is a kind of current, if you had many of them non-interacting. So sigma is a conductivity, how much current of particles you generate when you apply an external field to your system, and a relation between sigma and the diffusion of a single particle without field at equilibrium. So this is a very neat and important relation which tells you that response to an external drive close to equilibrium is 1 over kT, temperature, times fluctuations, quadratic fluctuations at equilibrium. So this is the beginning of a whole theory which was developed again by many people, goes under the name of Ryugo Kubo in the 50s or 60s, whole theory, and that tells you that you can compute transport coefficients, resistivities, conductivities, magnetic susceptibilities, whatever you like, linear transport coefficients, as equilibrium correlation functions. So you can forget about the drive, study your system at equilibrium, and know something about how it responds to external drive, external force. So let's go to something which is slightly more elaborate. Again, each transparent could be almost a half-an-hour lecture. This is Brownian motion. Suppose I make a picture of it. I have this particle, and I wait for long enough. And for some reason, when I show the picture to the people, I mount it in a reverse way. It means that like in old movies, it goes backward in time. Well, if I do it for an egg following on the ground, you will immediately see that I mounted my movie in the wrong way. But if I do it for Brownian motion, you will not be able to tell that I made a mistake in shooting the movie or showing you the movie. What I mean by that is that if you consider a system at the microscopic scale, the basic microscopic equations are reversible by time reversal, invariant by time reversal. So the t goes to minus t does not affect the Newton equation or even the Schrödinger equation. So it means that at the microscopic scale, at equilibrium, you cannot distinguish between forward and backward time, which also means that the trajectory, here I'm drawing a trajectory, suppose I discretize space and phase space, so I suppose that my particle is in state C0 during a given time, then it goes to state C1, then to state C2, and so on and so on. So this trajectory as a function of time, and the time reverse trajectory, C capital T minus small t, these two trajectories have exactly the same probability of appearing in equilibrium statistical mechanics. Okay? That's a very, very strong requirement, and this very strong requirement comes from basic physics. You see, it's something which goes beyond stat mech or whatever. So I'm forgetting about weak force here, of course. There is a slight things to do more seriously about that. But in general, classical physics or even basic quantum physics are time reversal invariant. And this time reversal invariance, in fact, Onsager understood that it goes into an equation. It goes into a principle, which is called the principle of detail balance. And this principle of detail balance tells you that the rate of going from a configuration at the microscopic scale C to the micro configuration C prime, multiplied by the energy Boltzmann factor of C, is equal to the reverse rate multiplied by the weight by the Boltzmann factor C prime. Okay, so that's very important. In fact, it's even so important that people realized, and I would say that only quite recently, that it became very, very clear that this is in fact not only characteristic, but you can use it, this relation, or more generally, the time reversal invariance property, you can use it as a definition of what equilibrium is. Because you may have noticed that I've been talking about equilibrium since the beginning, but I never told you what it is. Okay? So now people say that a system is at equilibrium, at thermal equilibrium, if it's time reversal invariant, and if this kind of relation, or if an avatar of it, is satisfied by your microscopic transition rates. Okay, so this looks a bit formal, but it's in fact quite important. Onsager used it immediately in the same group of two papers to deduce some very nice relations about generalized susceptibilities. So again, I don't know if you have already learned these things, but if you have, for example, a crystal which is anisotropic, and you apply temperature or pressure difference or whatever, if it's piezoelectric or voltage potential difference, let's talk here about temperature differences along height, length, and width, 3 different temperature differences, you will have heat current. If your crystal is a bit anisotropic, strange things could happen. You could very well apply a temperature difference along the horizontal direction and get a heat current along the vertical direction. There could be some anisotropy, but at the linear level, you will say that the heat current, will be linearly related to the 3 possible gradients of your heat, so delta T1 over delta Z1, and so on and so on. And there will be some coefficients which are generalized susceptibilities, heat conductivities. Well, what Onsager was able to prove using this time reversal invariance is that this tensor, this matrix Lik, has to be symmetric. So again, this may look a bit innocuous like that, but this is extremely important. Onsager got the Nobel Prize for that. Why is it so important? First of all, it saves you half of the work. You don't have to measure n square guys, but only n plus 1 over 2. Okay? Almost half of the work is saved. But it's much more important than that, because here I'm talking only about temperatures, but you have plenty of cross effects. Piezoelectric, you apply pressure, you get a difference of potential. Or you apply a difference of potential, you get a friction force. Magnetoelectric, piezomagnetoelectric. You can invent whatever you like. And what Onsager tells you is that if you express things in the right units, if you have some effect which exists, for example, I'm saying something probably wrong, but I'm not an experimentalist, unfortunately. And so if it's wrong, please tell me. Suppose I apply some temperature difference and I have some magnetic field that appears. Who knows? Well, probably tensorially it's not very good. So something that appears. Well, it tells you that if I do the opposite and I apply this something, then a temperature difference will appear. So it tells you that there is always a reciprocal effect, and this is extremely important. Well, for thermoelectric effect, I should not have looked for complicated things. Of course, thermoelectric effects are typical of these kind of things. Temperature difference, voltage, and so on and so on. Okay, so this is the end of the recap of, semi-recap of StatMech and thermodynamics. Linear response and what was called till the 70s non-equilibrium thermodynamics allows you to understand systems at equilibrium, this is thermodynamics, and close to equilibrium using Einstein relation or Onsager relations. And one crucial ingredient is time reversal invariance. And I want to emphasize the fact that till the mid-90s, for you, for many of you, it's a long time ago, but for some of us, it's not so long ago. Till the mid-90s, these were mostly the only things that were known in the field. When Hilarion and myself, we were students, we stopped our lecture on StatMech with Onsager and Einstein. And now I'm going to tell you what happened since then, hopefully. Okay, but just again, another small recap. So suppose I want to study a system which is very simple, a bar of metal, which is connected to two reservoirs at different temperatures, T1 and T2, or different chemical potentials, mu1, mu2, or different electrical potentials, V1, V2. What's going to happen? So if the reservoirs, I'll use the temperature metaphor, not to say all the time, or voltage, or particle potential. So suppose the temperatures are equal, well then we can describe the system using equilibrium StatMech. We know that the state of this system at thermal equilibrium can be characterized by very few parameters, volume and temperature, magnetic field and temperature, whatever, it depends on the problem. And the equation of state of the system can be calculated by optimizing the free energy. Okay, so we know how to proceed. And once we're able to compute this equation of state or the free energy, which is even more important, more fundamental, we can study phase transitions, why ice becomes water, for example. And we can study statistical fluctuations. And we can also study something very important, which is called universality classes, which means that different phase transitions are not necessarily similar. Some phase transitions have similar features, although they happen in very different systems. Some other phase transitions belong to other classes, and the classifications of possible phase transitions or different universality classes is something which has occupied many physicists till the end of the mid-80s or the end of the 70s, and this is a kind of Everest which has been climbed up by people doing theoretical physics, macroscopic theoretical physics. Okay, now suppose that the difference of temperatures between right and left are very small in relative value. And then we can use perturbation theory, linear response. We know that there will be a current which will set in, a heat current. We know that the heat current will be proportional to the first order, to lowest order, to the gradient of temperature. And we can compute the conductivity, which is associated to the constant of proportionality. We can compute that conductivity by using quadratic correlations at equilibrium. This is Einstein relation. So we have a kind of complete theory at this level. But one thing which is important to notice is that even for this very simple example, equilibrium thermodynamics is out. Why is it out? Because as long as you have a flow of current, let's think about a flow of voltage of electric current. If you have a flow of electric current, you have the Joule effect. So heat is generated. And if heat is generated, entropy is generated. So there is no point of maximizing the entropy. Entropy is growing linearly with time. Okay? And if entropy is growing linearly with time, free energy also is changing with time. So the basic principle of optimizing potential from thermodynamics, entropy, free energy, Gibbs energy, just fails totally. At most, you could think that something like entropy production per unit time could be something useful. This was the work of somebody called Prigogine and his school in the 60s and 70s. But people have discovered since then, quite recently, that unfortunately using entropy production rates is only a way of reformulating linear response theory, but doesn't allow you to tell you more about non-equilibrium. So it's time to go to non-equilibrium because we know that most of the things in nature, and especially living things, are far from equilibrium. So we absolutely have to understand these kind of things. And I have to warn you already so that you are not too disappointed by the end of the seminar. For the moment being, there is no full theory. Okay? There are some bits of things that people are understanding, trying to put together. Information has appeared in the last 20, 25 years. Progress has been done, but nothing like what is taught in equilibrium thermodynamics or in, all this phase transition theory and so on. It's not at all at this stage of understanding yet. So there's still a lot of work to be done. So let's take again the same picture. This is a picture that almost everybody doing non-equilibrium stat mech uses. There are some variants. Sometimes people, instead of putting circles here, put squares. But this is the only difference I've noticed. So now suppose that the two temperature potentials, whatever, on the two reservoirs on the boundaries are just different, really different. They are not equal, they are not close in a relative value, they are just different. So to understand that, there is no Boltzmann-Gibbs law. We don't know if there is an underlying probability distribution that tells you how a microscopic configuration of this object is sampled. So there are many questions. If you think about thermodynamics, we know that there are a few relevant parameters, V and T, whatever. Here, we don't really know who are the relevant parameters. We should probably have to put the temperature on the boundaries, maybe the length of the system, maybe the value of the current, but we don't really know. The volume, whatever. We know that in thermodynamics we can use entropy, free energy, Gibbs energy. There are some functions, some potentials. For such a simple system, we don't really know if there are any functions that help us to describe the stationary state of this system. Universality is very important for equilibrium physics. We don't know if there is any universality for such models. We hope so. Otherwise, if every model is different, every system is different, physics is not there anymore. As I told you, there is no Boltzmann-Gibbs equivalent for this kind of system. I will not going to write exponential minus e over k t1 plus t2 over 2 or square root of t1, t2. This is just wrong, plainly wrong. And what about fluctuations? What plays the role of Brownian motion? If we have a current flowing from left to right and we monitor it, it will have an average value given by Ohm's law, for example, and it will fluctuate. Are the fluctuations Gaussian? What do they look like? This is also something that needs to be explored. The major difference is that, okay, in non-equilibrium state, you have a current that flows, and this current that flows breaks time reversal invariance. If I make a movie of this thing and I project it backwards, you will tell me, no, you made it wrong, because the current is flowing from cold to hot, or from low potential to high potential. This is wrong, okay? So you have a sense of time, a direction of time, and this is important. So somehow the current carries a fingerprint of non-equilibrium. So this is really one observable we want to understand. So in the last 2 decades, since 95, I would say, there are many results, but I would say there are 2 major results which are very general results that have appeared in the field and that now have become kind of knowledge in the field. They were controversial at the beginning. even for a few years in the case of work identities, but now people believe in them. So these two results, I gave some generic names, so people do not have a nomenclature to call them yet. So the first results are the so-called work identities or Dzerzhinsky identities. And they have led to the development of a kind of extension of thermodynamics, which is called stochastic thermodynamics, on which many people are working nowadays in Europe, in America, for example, Ken Sekimoto here in France, or Udo Seifert in Germany, and many other people. And the second type of relations or results are the so-called fluctuation theorems, which have had many fathers. I usually call them the Galavotti-Cohen theorem because they are kind of the first one with Evans and Morris to have undigged the thing. And these fluctuation theorems that I'm going to explain soon but very fast, they have led to the large deviation theory of macroscopic fluctuations, which I'm going to end with if I have enough time. So let's start maybe with the easiest part, which are the Dzerzhinsky type of identities, the work identities. You remember this maximal work inequality that we know from classic thermodynamics. The maximal work we can extract from a thermal system is, at best, the decrease of free energy. We cannot do better than that. And one thing that I took care to write is that this is the maximal work on average. Because, you know, if you do very precise measurements, there are always thermal fluctuations, so the work can slightly fluctuate from one experiment to the other. But the average maximal work you can extract, because thermodynamics only talks about averages, the average maximal work you can extract is at best minus delta F. Okay? But there are fluctuations. So instead of computing the average of the work, I can compute other averages. So Mr. Dzerzhinsky had a strange idea. He decided to compute not the average of the work.
Why do you put average on W but not on F?
Because F is something which is determined, which is not fluctuating. It's determined by the external parameters of my system, by the external temperature, by the volume, and they don't fluctuate. But the average pulling work that I'm doing on some RNA strand, this thing is fluctuating. Okay? So this delta F is really the free energy that I compute using the formula for the free energy for the initial volume, the temperature, and whatever you like, the pressure if you want, and so on. So Dzerzhinsky had the original idea to try to compute the average of the exponential of the work divided by kT. You have to put it in non-dimensional form anyway. And he discovered that this average is equal to exponential minus delta F over kT. It's a strict equality. So once again, if I measure the work or extract work from a system, and I do it in a very irreversible way, I pull on my piston like crazy, I will never get minus delta F. I will get less than that because it's irreversible. So I will never do as good as I can do by doing things in a reversible manner. Real processes are irreversible, and you cannot saturate your bound. Okay? But what Dzerzhinsky shows is that if you think again about the gas and the piston, whatever you do, even if you do it in a very non-reversible way, non-quasi-static, you pull on your piston like crazy, but you compute the average of the exponential, then there is always equality. Even if you drive your system very far from equilibrium, so you do things in a very non-reversible way. Okay, again, it looks like a mathematical identity, but it has some incredible consequences. You see, for example, let's see, some consequences. Well, this is Dzerzhinsky. Looks like a nice guy too. By the way, yeah, this identity by using convexity implies the good old maximal work theorem. So it means that something which was unknown for 150 years almost, this was known by the end of 19th century, and more than 100 years later, somebody discovered that there's a stronger equality that implies this inequality. This is already something very striking. You know, you learn that, you think that it's finished, it's over. I mean, thermodynamics is a science which is, totally finished and nothing interesting to learn about it. And somebody comes and tells you, no, there is something underlying it which is stronger and which implies what was known before. This is already something intellectually very, very impressive. The next thing is that in order to have equality here, if you think about it mathematically, to have the equality here, you cannot have W always less than minus delta F. Okay? You must have sometimes some experiments in which W has to go the other way. Because if W was always, in all experiments, at best equal to minus delta F or strictly less, this average would be less. It's just not possible. Okay? If you have average marks which are less than 10, well, you cannot have all your marks more than 11. I'm just saying something trivial like that. But this is trivial, but this is something which led to many, many controversies. It means that in some experiments, the measured work will be bigger than minus delta F. In some individual realizations of your experiments, you will violate the second principle of thermodynamics. Well, in fact, you don't violate the second principle of thermodynamics because the second principle of thermodynamics is on averages. And if you do many experiments and you do the average, you will find that. Okay? But you can have some individual phenomena that happens that goes somehow the other way around, that goes backward in times. And this was quite striking. By the way, this was checked already a long time ago by experiments, and this is really doing the experiments that made people believe in that theory. Because the theory has some, hypotheses, the calculations are done in a certain framework, and many people said, okay, very nice, it's a mathematical theorem, but it cannot be true in reality. It's only when people did the experiment that after that, physicists, the general public of physicists, started believing in that. Okay, there is a refinement of Dzerzhinsky's identity that I'm not going to talk about, which is Krook's identity. Anyway, let's go now to large deviations and to fluctuation theorems. I still have half an hour, I think. Yeah. Okay. So when we do StatMech, we study fluctuations, we study averages, and we use two major results from probability theory. We use the law of large numbers. If I take a coin and I make 1,000, 1 million flips, roughly 500,000 will be up, 500,000 will be head, and 500,000 will be tail. And more precisely, if I take the number of heads and I divide by the number of experiments, 1 million, this converges to 1/2. The bigger number of experiments I do, the closer to 1/2 it gets. Okay? That's the law of large numbers. It's even better than that. If I make a zoom around 500,000, in fact, I will have 500,000 plus or minus square root of 1 million. So the deviation around the average of the order of square root of n. Okay? This you probably learned, or you will learn, that the law of large number, in fact, there are some fluctuations which are typically Gaussian and of the order of square root of n. But we can ask another question, which is a bit more intricate. We can say we do an experiment, and we compute the number of heads divided by the total number of trials, 1 million, and we want the number of heads, the fraction of heads, to be 0.2, something unlikely, okay, or to be any ratio between 0 and 1. So this is a rare event, something that happens very rarely, because we know that typically we'll get 1/2. And this rare event, in fact, becomes rarer and rarer, exponentially rarer, as the number of trials n goes to infinity. Okay? So the deviations around the mean becomes, in relative value, smaller and smaller. But still, we can ask this question, and we can try to compute or to measure this large deviation function, phi of r, which tells you how rare a rare event is. Okay, it's exponentially rare, but we want to quantify its rarity. For the simple example of up and downs, even for a twine which is not fair but which is biased with P and Q, you can compute it. It's just a binomial calculation, and you get something which should remind you of a kind of entropy formula. Another question we may ask, suppose we are in a big room like that one, so there is a gas at temperature T, we have closed everything, it's at equilibrium, and we know that on average, the density of the gas is uniform, given by the total number of particles of gas, of air, divided by the volume of the room. But we may ask a question, a bit again more subtle. What is the probability that the density profile in this room is such that I have 5% more density of air here, and sorry for the people at the back, 5% less there, so you suffocate. So what is the probability that this density profile is not uniform, but takes any function, okay? So we can try to compute this probability function of a profile, rho of x, and the calculation falls into the realm of equilibrium statistical mechanics. You can do it, and you can compute this large deviation functional of the density profile rho. Well, this large deviation functional, if you do the calculation, you will discover that it's up to an integral and some constant. It is given by the free energy of your gas. So free energy characterizes also deviations, large deviations far from equilibrium. In fact, you can forget about classical thermodynamics and equilibrium statistical mechanics. You can introduce free energy, entropy, all the thermodynamic potentials by asking the relevant questions of this type for large deviations. It's an alternative way of writing statistical mechanics. Okay? So free energy can be seen as a large deviation function. So now I told you our main problem in non-equilibrium statistical mechanics is that we don't have free energy. We don't have entropy, because these objects grow or have no meanings far from equilibrium. But we can very well ask some precise questions for large deviations. For example, take again our two reservoirs at two different temperatures. So I will have on average, my temperature profile will be linear, okay, from, let's say, low temperature to high temperature. The current should flow this way. I made a mistake in my drawing anyway. So I know that the average temperature profile is linear, but I may ask, what is the probability of seeing this red temperature profile? If I'm able to compute that, I will put my hand on an object which looks like a non-equilibrium free energy. Okay? Another question I may ask, so I have still my reservoirs, high temperature from low temperature. I have a current flowing, so I can compute the total number of charge that went from left to right in a given time t. So yt is the total charge or the total heat that flowed between 0 and t from left to right. Okay. And I can ask myself, I know the average value, let's say it's given by Ohm's law if I'm near linear response, but what is the probability of getting an empirical current which is twice the one which is predicted by a simple U equal to Ri, or 95% less, whatever. So what is the probability of having a total number of charges flowing from left potential to right potential divided by time equal to J? This is the empirical measured current during time t. The probability that is given by a value small j, which is not equal to the mean nominal current that I typically expect. Like, you know, head and tails, I expect it 50-50. But I can ask myself, what's the probability of getting 20% and 80%? So here again, I have a large deviation function of the current that I can try to compute. Okay? So this function phi of the current, by the way, is a positive function. Probabilities are less than 1. It vanishes at the typical current, because the typical current has probability almost 1. And in fact, for t going to infinity, it has probability 1, strictly. Okay? So the bigger the t, the closest to 1 is this quantity 1j is equal to capital J. So it's positive and vanishes at the typical current, and it's convex. So it's a kind of potential. Something, you know, which is positive, which has a form like that, and which is minimal at your typical state. The more general question I may ask, and again, sorry for the sign of the current, it should be the other way around. What is the probability of observing a non-typical density profile together with a non-typical current during a given time and at different places of space? So what is the probability of observing a current profile and a density profile during time t? And this is again given by a large deviation functional that if we are able to compute it, then by taking integrals over rho or j, we may get the previous two large deviation functions from it. So this is a kind of very general object, okay? And if you think about it, well, we are trying to mimic Boltzmann's law. We are trying to write something, some probability in the type of an exponential minus something, okay? So all this smells good. Why does it smell particularly good? Is this because Galavotti and Cohen and other people proved that large deviation functions very generally satisfy a very simple symmetry relation. They are not even, but almost. The difference of phi of j, where phi is a large deviation function, minus phi of minus j is just linear in j. There is no j cube, there is no tangent j, there is no sine j, it's just linear in j. And this is a strong statement that again relies on the fact that ultimately, if you think about your system and you add to it the dynamics of the reservoirs, the dynamics of whatever is important in your problem, it has to be time reversal invariant in the end, because physics is time reversal invariant. So that's the key feature behind this symmetry, this simple identity satisfied generically by large deviation functions. And if we go back to the definition of the large deviation, so this is the probability of seeing a current j is exponential minus t phi of j. Well, you can see very easily that this relation implies that the probability of seeing a forward current divided by the probability of seeing a backward current is exponentially large in time and proportional to j times the constant alpha. Alpha is a constant that depends on your problem. I will give you a specific example very soon. So what makes the Galavotti-Cohen theorem important is that this is a functional relation, functional equation. If you expand this functional equation near equilibrium to first and second order, you reconstruct the classical results of Einstein and Onsager, which were the only known result till the mid-90s. But this is a relation which is valid at all orders. So you can get nonlinear generalizations of Einstein, Onsager, and Kubo's relation. Okay? So it's quite important. It embodies a whole series of identities. First two are the classical ones of Einstein and Onsager. So let's take again the leitmotif of the heat reservoirs, temperature T1 and T2. You have a heat flow. You have a heat Q of T, which has flown from left to right during time T. So what is the probability of observing a heat current J divided by a heat current minus J? It's exponential J times T times beta 1 minus beta 2, 1 over kt2 minus 1 over kt1. So this is a kind of generalization, again, to this Boltzmann principle, if you wish. And the Galavotti-Cohen identity tells you that somehow you have to put the two temperatures of the reservoirs on this identity. This is quite satisfying because it comes from ab initio principle, time reversal invariance, and in the end the result you get is not too bizarre. I mean, if you had got some very bizarre function of kt1 and kt2, it would have been deceptive. But this is somehow the nicest result you could have guessed. But this is rigorous. Okay, so I hope I convinced you that large deviations are quite important. And that's why people who in the 60s would have computed free energies and tried to understand phase transitions and so on, well, the sons or the grandsons of these people are now trying to compute large deviation functions for systems far from equilibrium. Okay? So this is a kind of new goal for people doing non-equilibrium StatMech, is to analyze systems and to understand what large deviation functions look like. So I'm going to the last part of this talk. So again, now each slide could be a 1 hour lecture, and I'm not joking. For some of them, I really do that. So I just give you some hint or some flavor of the kind of work that's done in that field, hoping that it will raise some interest among you. And if you have more questions, well, we'll talk about it later. So I told you that there are some very generic relations to understand systems far from equilibrium, but these relations are generic. So they are very general, but they are not specific and they are not very precise. They are general. If you want to know more precise things, another point of view in theoretical physics is to study models. So you define some very precise models and you try to beat them to death. You kill them. You try to extract as much information as you can from these very specific models. And then you compare with general theories and try to guess also, to build new, you solve a model, 2 models, 3 models, and you find that something seems to be true in these models. Then maybe it's true in general, okay? So let's see what kind of things we can do. Again, the same picture. I think probably it's the only thing one may remember from this talk. Well, this same simple picture of a current flowing, you may try to represent it as an interacting particle system. You may try to represent it as particles jumping on a lattice with 2 reservoirs and making a kind of random walkers or Brownian motions with some rules. And you want to understand how many particles have flown from left to right. So such a simple model of interacting random walkers, the only interaction I put is that I don't allow 2 particles to be at the same place. Kind of Coulomb repulsion, very crude Coulomb repulsion, okay? You could do better, but if you try to do better, you cannot compute anything anymore. So you have to look at the simplest possible model. So this very simple model have in fact aroused very much interest. One reason is that it comes from biology. It comes from the so-called single file diffusion model. If you take small particles in a very wide tube and you tag one particle, you will see that it flows, but it also diffuses like a Brownian motion. Now if you take very thick particles, big ones, big balls, in a small tube, so that they are not allowed to overtake each other, so the order between particles is conserved, you will have the phenomenon of single file diffusion. Whereas in normal diffusion, the quadratic average of the position is linear in time, in the case of single file diffusion, you have anomalously slow diffusion, and the quadratic average is known as square root of time, okay? Which means that the root mean square is t to the power 1/4, whereas for diffusion, the root mean square is square root of t. So this single file diffusion can be easily modeled by playing with this kind of model, this kind of representation. By the way, there have been some experiments also, some coined experiment in, for example, in Beschinger's group in Stuttgart. He built a narrow file and he put through it some green here particles, okay, objects. And if the thing is so narrow that only one particle, a particle cannot overtake the one in front or behind it, you have single file diffusion. If it's big enough that particles can overtake each other, like in a car flow, you have normal diffusion. And this group measured many, many features of this problem, which is quite interesting for people doing soft condensed matter physics. But I'm not so much interested in the real aspects. I want to emphasize more on some theoretical aspects of these models. These models, for example, the one I draw here, have a wonderful feature. These interacting particle processes, these mathematical models, they are in fact rich enough to get some physics, so they are not trivial for physicists, fortunately. But they are also intricate enough from the mathematical point of view that they have some mathematical symmetry structures underlying them that allows them to be solved exactly. They are so-called integrable models, okay? And for these models, you can get exact solutions. And these exact solutions, you can use them as benchmarks to study more general theories or study approximation methods. So I'm just throwing words here. I'm not going to give you details, but the idea that these models are integrable, solvable, comes from quantum physics. In fact, from a work of Hans Bethe, 1931, to solve the Heisenberg spin chain. And he invented a method which has become a kind of basic tool to solve exactly most of the models that we know to solve exactly. And they evolve in a new branch of probability, which is being developed nowadays, which are called integrable probabilities and determinantal processes. So they are of major interest to mathematicians. Another way of looking at them, and we are going to end with that, is to do their continuous limit and have a hydrodynamic description of them. So I will just very fast, in the last 5-7 minutes, show you some results. Don't look at the formulas, but just to tell you what can we compute. Well, we have this system with particles which are jumping. We can compute the large deviation function of the current in this system. We can really get a rather simple formula in some cases, more involved formula, but for the large deviation function, for the free energy, quote unquote, of the current. It's also possible to do it for the density profile. Another thing we can do, we can put a tag particle there, put some fluorophore on it, and monitor its position. It's possible to get the full probability distribution of a tag particle and the large deviation function. Not only the average or the variance, but the full distribution. And the distribution is not Gaussian. You see, this does not look like a Gaussian. Now some more general problems. This is a very nice problem. I take, and it becomes almost like a play problem. I take now an infinite line, and I put particles from 0 to minus infinity. Again, with the exclusion condition, I cannot make two particles on the same site. So the first particle can jump with rate 1, with probability dt in time t. Once this one has jumped, this one may jump here, or this one may jump twice, and so on. So there will be a flow of particles going from left to right. One can compute what is the probability of having a current of a given value. What is the probability that the current is bigger than n after time t? It's an integer. The current is the number of particles that have flown from left to right. Well, these are quite intricate and beautiful calculations that have been done in the last 5-10 years. You have an exact formula for that. And the thing which is a miracle is that this exact formula relates to something which has nothing to do. Random matrix theory. Random matrix theory, which appeared from Wigner in nuclear physics a long time ago. So random matrices, which are matrices with random entries given by Gaussians, and symmetric matrices or Hermitian matrices, they appear in this game. And thanks to the work of some people like Johansson and many others after, you can exactly compute the distribution of the current. You can get a closed formula, and you have a new kind of distribution functions that appear, which are not Gaussian. They're related to some other functions, Pain-Levé equations, again, some classical 19th century mathematics arising in the field, but they are definitely not Gaussian. Okay? And they seem to be quite universal. Just like the Gaussian was universal in equilibrium statistical mechanics, these new distributions seem to play an important role. So the same kind of distributions appear in another problem, which is the Kardar-Parisi-Yang equation. Don't look at the equation, just think I have a piece of paper and I burn it. I put some fire on it. The paper will burn and the front will move up. Okay? Or if you think about it, it's a kind of Tetris game. I'm throwing Tetris rhombis on an interface. What is the distribution of the interface after a given time? Well, in fact, this distribution of the interface can be mapped exactly to that problem, so to random matrices. So it can be computed exactly. So all this may appear to you to be a bit mathematical, but it's not only mathematical. So this equation KPZ has been solved exactly by many groups in the last, and is still being explored by many groups recently, including people working in France, like Pierre Ledoussal and Alberto Rosso, and Calabrese was a visitor from Trieste. So these people have been able to compute some characteristics of the interface dynamics. And in the meanwhile, a group of Japanese experimentalists, Kazumasa Takeuchi and his PhD advisor, Sano, did some experimental studies on liquid crystals. So they had a grain of liquid crystal which was growing by applying some external field and invading another phase. You can think about it as a crystal which is growing. And they were measuring the surface, you see the interface here, and trying to look at how the statistical features of the interface look like. What is the average value of this interface? What is the distribution of this interface? They also started with some other experimental realization. So they were able to do some very neat experimental measurements. And the miracle is that when they did the measurement, they did find a distribution, which maybe for non-exerted eyes, everything looks like a Gaussian, but they are not Gaussian, and they are precisely given by this mathematical formula. So they were able to dig them out from the experiment, from nature. So it's not only mathematical, intellectual work, intellectual pursuit, but it happens in true life. I still have a few minutes, or I should end. 2 minutes. Okay, so I will just end very fast by telling you that all these things, they require integrability and combinatorics and a lot of, subtle mathematics. But fortunately, a group in Rome around Gianni Lasigno, who's also a very great particle physicist, Gianni Lasigno, developed a way to compute large deviation functions for the general problem I told you about, as they gave a formula for this function. And this formula, which is a variational formula, which is called the macroscopic fluctuation theory, this formula seems to play, in a restrictive sense, the role of a Boltzmann-Gibbs formula for certain non-equilibrium systems, for driven diffusive non-equilibrium systems. So there is a lot of excitement around this formula, and I'm going to conclude with that. If you do some work on this variational formula and write the associated Euler-Lagrange equations, you get a new set of hydrodynamical equations to describe non-equilibrium features, non-equilibrium flows. And this new set of non-equilibrium equations, which look like a bit, typical equations that we encounter in physics, well, they excite a lot of people. Because people say, okay, we have now a new set of equations. Suppose somebody like Navier-Stokes give you a new set of equations. You're very excited. Well, here, people like Gianni Lasigno and his co-workers give us some equations to explore and to try to play with them on many different systems. So there is a lot of excitement trying to understand what these hydrodynamic equations contain. But unfortunately, for the moment being, nobody have been able to solve them. And the only solutions that we have for these equations are the ones which are obtained by doing combinatorics at the microscopic level for the exclusion process or more general interacting processes. So here we are. We want to understand non-equilibrium statistical mechanics through the prism of large deviation functions, because large deviation functions appear to be the right generalizations of thermodynamic potentials. These large deviation functions satisfy some generic equations, Galavotti-Cohen fluctuation theorem, work theorem, Dzerzhinsky-Crook relations, in some different contexts. So they are objects. We have kind of thermodynamic generic properties. They have also some nice mathematical properties. They are convex in many cases, and so on and so on. And thanks to different groups, in particular the Rome group led by Gianni Lasigno, there is a kind of ansatz, a variational ansatz, to compute a general large deviation function for driven systems out of equilibrium, which leads to hydrodynamic equations, to a kind of fluctuating hydrodynamics, which currently people are trying to study and to solve and to explore to see if we can see non-equilibrium phase transitions using this variational principle, and so on and so on. There's still a lot of work to be done. Thank you.
I have a question about Dzerzhinsky inequality. You mentioned some experiments which tested it, and all those experiments here, they were for very small systems. So I was confused because the inequality, as you wrote it, it could be applied also for a very big system, but very much out of equilibrium. So why in these experiments they had to go to small systems? And also what's the status of this inequality as applied to small systems?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. Again, I mean, this is something I gave a course of 5 hours on that. So all questions are good and they are deep. So it's a equality, and it's a general equality, whatever the size of the system. The problem is that you have to be able to sample your system to have a good statistics of that. And in fact, you have, in particular, to have this equality, you have to see things like that, events which go wrong. And in fact, these events are exponentially rare with the size of the system. So they do exist, but if the system of size is 10 to the power 23, they appear exponential minus 10 to the 23. It's little, okay? So one reason you have to go to mesoscopic systems, or not too big systems, is that there the fluctuations are not so rare. So you can have a good statistics, and you can try out. So you're putting it in a kind of provocative way. Dzerzhinsky identity is mathematically true even for very big systems, but you're never going to be able to see it. I mean, for a system which is macroscopic. So you have to go to, but on the meanwhile, and of course people in this room know that infinitely better than me, there has been a huge amount of progress on manipulating, single RNA molecules and putting fluorophores on doing single experiments on single objects. This is something which has been, of course, developed a lot in the last 1 or 2 decades. So it comes on time. I mean, if the same equality was written 100 years ago, I'm not sure that people would have been excited by it.
Sorry, I have also a basic question. You have an average on this equation, but you didn't tell us how you took the average. In fact, you also told us we don't know what the ensemble should be. So what is the average?
Yeah, so again, one has to go into the details. So what you do is that, for example, you deform your Hamiltonian of your system according to a given protocol. So you have an average you start with a system which is thermalized. You start with your system, with your piston and your gas at volume V1, temperature T, and pressure P, okay? So you start in the Gibbs ensemble. And then you pull into your piston with a given protocol. So you try to always pull either with the same force or the same displacement. Then you have to change your ensemble to do some Legendre transform. But suppose you always pull the same way. And what you do the average on is on the Gibbs measure initially and on the repeated experiment with a given protocol, which is always the same. So this is the mathematical average. Now in practical, you may have to be a bit more careful or so on, but mathematically the theorem holds in this way. So you pull onto your piston with a given, you have your V of t, which is given, and you have statistics on the initial Gibbs ensemble for a finite time. And you reach your final volume in a finite time. In a finite time, you have not converged to the Gibbs ensemble at finite volume, but you don't care, because you block your piston. And in fact, the proof is deceptively simple. You've probably seen it. It's almost a triviality. It's a tautology. But it works.
Yeah. Could you give a flavor of how this is infer from first principle, these properties? How you get to this? Just a flavor?
Yeah, a flavor. Yeah. But if I give you a flavor, I can give you a flavor, but it will be deceptive. In fact, what you call the work, what is the work? So you have to define precisely the work, but you suppose that you have a system which is Hamiltonian, and in your Hamiltonian, something becomes time dependent. Okay? For example, you have a I'm losing my words. Il y a un string avec une raideur k, et cette raideur devient indépendante du temps, k of t. Okay? So at the beginning you have k0, and you make this k depend of t. Or you have, it's more easy, you have a potential well, which is localized at x0. So your potential is 1/2 k x minus x0 square, and you make your optical potential move. So x0 becomes a function of t. Okay? So you have a tweezer and you move it. So your Hamiltonian becomes time dependent. Now if you think about, and this is one of the main features, in fact, the work of Jarzynski and Crookes have, you know, when we are little, we learn about work and heat, but I never understood what it meant, in fact, work, heat. And this has led to a huge amount of thinking again about what is work and heat at the microscopic scale. So if you think about work in this case that I told you, well, what is the work? It's essentially the derivative of the Hamiltonian with respect to the parameter times dt integrated. Okay? dh d lambda, where lambda is the position of your center of your parabola, dt, or lambda dot dt. That's the work you do, okay, from Hamiltonian dynamics. And here comes the totally deceptive feature. I mean, it's almost trivial, but consequences are not. So this is the work, but you have an Hamiltonian system. So d rho h d rho lambda, which is d rho h dt, because there's a lambda dot, is also the total derivative. So it's h final minus h initial. So the work you do on your system is just the difference of energy at the final time minus the energy at the initial time. So now if you do exponential minus the work, so it's exponential minus beta, h final minus h initial. That's exponential of the work divided by kt. But now I'm weighing it with exponential minus beta h initial. So the terms go away, and you end up with exponential minus beta h final, which is the free energy, the definition of the free energy. So you see somehow the fact that you're taking the average on the Gibbs state initially, and you're taking the work in the exponential, it just cancels. And you just end up, because the work is the difference between the energies, so it's exponential, the difference of the energies, and you're multiplying by exponential minus the initial energy, so you end up with the exponential of the initial energy. It is as simple as that. It's really nothing more. But this is for Hamiltonian system. Then, okay, and then the people, I mean, he took 1 year to publish his first PRL, Jarzynski. But then he was, you know, persistent enough to do it for Langevin systems. So now you take a particle which is in a heat bath, and it still works. You have to change the proof, but it still works. Then he took some other thermal reservoirs. He took a Markov system. And for each framework, you can prove a variant of this identity. But in fact, it's very, very, very elementary. It's very probable that some people even teach it in M1 or L3, because it's quite simple.
So there is a temperature in the Jarzynski identity, so I guess that it only works for isothermal transformations. So
again, all these questions are extremely good and subtle. What I say is that I start with a system which is thermalized at a given temperature. So the system is in a Gibbs state. When I pull on the piston like crazy, there's even no temperature anymore in the system. There are turbulence, waves, whatever. Then I let the piston at its end position, I clamps it. If I wait an infinite amount of time, it will probably reach again the environment temperature. But I don't do my statistics on the rest of the time. I just do my statistics on the motion. So the temperature which is here is just the temperature of the initial Gibbs state. But within the process, a priori, there's no reason to have a temperature. This is infinitely subtle, and it's true. And people, even very clever people, were, you know, very strongly against that and opposing it and saying that either it's trivial or it's bullshit or both. But it's not, probably not.
Okay. I think we have probably had enough questions, so let us thank Kiron again for his very nice seminar.